Buonasera.
Good evening. The meeting of today is the last appointment of today's theme, which had, amongst its other themes, questions surrounding surrounding school. It was a very positive experience today, and we spoke about many different issues together. In the next couple of days, we will continue, and for the rest of the year, we will continue on these themes. We focused on a special theme, an aspect of this theme, who is linked to schools knows the centrality of the text. This didn't begin by way of discussion, the idea for this focus on the text. But it happened because we had a common interest on this relationship of the text. And this is why we have decided to dedicate this meeting to the text, because it has to do with welcoming the other, an idea of welcoming, hospitality, be it literary texts, ancient, modern, in our native language or in other languages. In either way, a text requests a gesture or implies a gesture of welcoming. Our friends will talk about this in a deeper way. They reciprocally welcomed each other, our speakers, in the way that they talked about the text. Raffaela Paggi is the principal of the secondary school of the Sacred Heart Foundation in Milan. She's an author of many books, and I quote the grammar book that she wrote. I think it's a text that many literature colleagues have used. She collaborated with the Ministry of Education for elementary schools. Stefano Arduini is a great authority in the field of translations, and he's also an inventor of workspaces for translators, for education of translators. He is a visiting professor of many universities in foreign countries. He is president of the Foundation Unicampus Pellegrino, which fosters education for translators. He has published many articles for scientific journals. I won't say everything that's in his curriculum because it would take too long. Davide Rondoni, poet and writer. We have a teacher, a translator, and a poet. Our three speakers are these three professions. His poems have been translated in many languages. He wrote many books, and he wrote one recently against literature, contro la letteratura. He is director of the magazine Clandestino. These are all gestures that have poems, poetry, and poetry at its center. Everything that has to do with poetry, Davide Rondoni is involved. All of all of our speakers live in their work the relationship with the text, a relationship with with a text. The last thing I would like to say, why did we decide to give this title to this meeting, Welcoming the Other? Because effectively, we realized, working together, that there is a way of approaching a text, be it through translation, through paraphrasing. There's a way of approaching these texts that is different, that has not to do with eliminating the diversity within this text. The text is diversity, like every person is a symbol of diversity. We would like to talk about a different kind of relationship with the text. We would like to make what Ungaretti says about his relationship with poetry, we would like to make it ours. I didn't look for Jacopone's, Guittone's, Dante's verses. I looked for their singing, the singing of the Italian language. And I think that this idea of searching for the singing can help us to enter into the theme of tonight. Because I think it is the relationship with a text, with a poetic text, but not only. Because I think every word is a part of a song. If we stop reading, I think that we risk losing the real motive behind the real reason for existence of poetry. Because the great secret of life is communicated through music and poetry. This harmony with the title of the meeting is the reason why I give the floor now to Raffaela Paggi. Thank you very much. The comparison between the etymology of the two important words of the title, which is text and the other, have to do with the meaning of education. The verb welcome derives from ospitare in Italian. Os means foreign person, pilgrim. And pa means to nurture. Ospite, guest, is someone who one gives aid and nurtures not for economic means but out of friendship. Ospite is therefore he who is nurtured and he who nurtures. Text comes from testum in Latin, which means to weave, tessere in Italian, weave in text. A text is a text when it makes sense. We will take for granted what our object is. Text is that communicative act through writing, through the structure of a text of words. And a help to understand the etymology of these two words, we can find in the first chapter of the biography of Pierluigi Capponi, in his encounter with Silvio Incestaio, when as a young person he experienced the earthquake of 86. I think there is a connection between his weaving and my writing. Just as he uses his elements to weave, in the same way I choose my words. How he chooses a rhythm, in the same way I choose a rhythm. In the way that he leaves an imprinting of himself, a part of himself, in the same way I leave a part of myself in the words, to reveal something of his existence. The relationship between cesto, weaver, and writer form and function also go together. Outside of this metaphor, a text is not enough by itself. It must be connected to he who writes it and he who reads it. Unfortunately, grammar has become subjected to a structuralism and analysis that, in name of a scientific method, brought texts to be treated like gym exercises and not an opportunity to have a dialogue with authors, men who have something to say to us. Sometimes we have reached a point of reading texts only to show certain rhetorical structures. And at the same time, as one of my favorite authors says, Stevenson, each of us has been attracted by reading through events. Has been attracted to reading by events that have been events through writing. Concepts, psychology, conversation were but obstacles that we have to get rid of with impatience. Events had an immediate quality to them. Very often we treat texts not like real entities, but strategies. We consider as very important in the comprehension of a text the relationship that the author has with the text. We talk about the effect on the meaning of a text in children of different ages and of different classes. And we don't talk about the intentions of the author. We tend to bring the attention on that relationship, mysterious relationship between reader and writer, that the text enlightens. The guest is he who asks for shelter. In what sense we are welcomed by a text? What kind of shelter do we give this type of guest? I will try to answer to these questions, at least partially, looking at the experience of texts that we have seen in school. We must, first of all, respect the wholeness of the plot. We have chosen texts on which to found our educational proposal, as well as the explanations of teachers. The anthologies are like a model. They are syntactical models. They organize reason and thought. The selection, though, is never a problem that we can say resolved. We must always deal with students whose concentration levels and whose approach to learning is very different. We have always seen, however, that in order to favor a relationship, a real relationship between the student and the text, it is important to read texts in their full length, in adequate time spans, texts that are intense from a semantic point of view and are capable of moving their reason and solicits them to interpret them. One of the best anthologies that go from one text to the other don't help. They don't allow the student to become passionate about or become affectionate towards the characters, become attached to the characters and their plots, and therefore to begin a dialogue with its content. The choice of the study materials is never easy. It is necessary to find a correct balance, depth of content, that it be at a correct difficulty level, and the vocabulary be rich to open new horizons. Words, in fact, are not only necessary for communicating, but have to do with the development of thought itself. We need words in order to think what we are and to know that we are. What seems more immediate, in fact, is the result of a mediation. We need words to know ourselves. We need a real encounter with a text. What we call rereading, because the choice of text is important, but it is not enough to favor this real, true experience with a text. We need to, in fact, all of literature favor a waking up of the student to respond to the questions that it wakes up within the student. Julian Carran says, the problem is to, first of all, wake the subject up, the student up, in order to involve him in the educational process. We have to be the ones who help the curiosity of the students, their questions, because if we don't, at some point, they will be blocked. These questions won't be posed anymore. I would like to, at the same time, we see that the text needs to have a woken up subject, but at the same time, it is also an instrument for helping students to wake up and ask questions. We think that reading out loud is important from infancy to teenage years. They must give voice to these texts. They give their voice to these texts. We are forced to be limited to a rationalist idea of reading, where the important thing is only to know, to have an understanding of what was said and then give a summary. The book, however, books are also an experience which is a much more broad horizon. It will be difficult to transmit a true interest to texts if teachers don't do so themselves. In our school, we have made as an obligatory step the dramatization of many texts with drama workshops. I'll read 2 comments from second year of middle school after having dramatized Boccaccio. Acting, when you have to act out a character, you have to give them a soul. It means to assume a responsibility. Acting means to become and not to pretend to become. It's not pretending, but being. The second comment, I all of a sudden felt that I was feeling the sentiments of suffering that Monna Giovanna was feeling at the time. This is the second comment. A method of analysis of texts should be addressed to allow students to interrogate the text. Analysis becomes important, in fact, when it is not an end, but a means to a verification of the universal meaning which happens when we welcome the text. As Lewis says, he says, the effect must precede the judgment of the effect. I have serious doubts that the activity of criticism is an exercise adequate or for addressed to young people. The reactions of an intelligent scholar in front of a book is much more spontaneous than parody and imitation. The necessary condition to read well is to become a part of the text. We don't. It is particularly dangerous to approach a text with suspicion. One of the great functions of reading is to give students ways of reading their experience, of interpreting their experience. But to do this, we need to have a true relationship with a text. Once we have read the text, we must go back and reread the text to verify the hypothesis of the first reading. If it is a diversified activity with dramatizations, illustrations, discussions, in order to delve down deeper into the meaning of the text, it is all the more effective. We must enter into the text and into the classroom with the concrete questions of the young students. I won't speak too much about the following, but the idea of translation is very important, because a guest is, in fact, as we said earlier, a foreigner, and the meaning is hidden, it must be revealed, etc. And this is all. We also find this in the field of translation. Translation has become one of the most important exercises, one of the most fruitful exercises for school. Classical languages as well play a big part in Italian schools. The project that began in 2015 in our third and fourth classes, which were translation workshops, amongst which texts that were of adequate length, and the translation of these texts. The idea was to compare various translations and discuss the various possibilities. Also, in relation to the destinations of these texts, of the translated text, if editorial or journalistic, etc. I conclude. Translations, reading out loud, reading the text in full length, are important to involve the student who is growing and to motivate this welcoming of the other. In other words, the hypothesis of that the words of the text, the hypothesis which is contained in the words of the text, and forces the student to compare these words with their experience. All of this could not be true. Our true experience cannot exist unless there is some kind of a risk. The author offers, the reader offers all its questions to the text, and the text offers a possible world, a universe, a proposal of order, a proposal of meaning. And finally, the reader can verify the positivity of this offer of the text, comparing what the text says and the reality.
Grazie La parola al professor Arduini.
Thank you. Now we pass on to Arduini. The intervention is introduced that translation is like an education. It is a way to use to educate. We've always done. We've all had an experience of translating in school, maybe in the classical, in Greek and Latin. So tonight I'm not going to talk about this type of translation. And I'd like to say that we are people that are always being translated. It is something that is in our existence. Even the way that we feel things, the way that we desire things, this all has to be translated, even outside of our community. We need to try and be understood and understand something that is not in our universe. There's a philosopher, Paul Rourke. We're always need to look for how we can try and accept something that we are trying to understand. To try and host something that for them seems incomprehensible. And so it is this in the translation that we identify something in ourselves. Even Heidegger. Tell me what you think of translating and I'll tell you who you are, Heidegger says. So in our current period, in our current epoch, we see how this can be challenged. How understanding things sometimes is so essential, and sometimes there has to be an explosion of interest to get interested in translating, in comprehending things. In the last 20 years, there's been this conviction that translating is something so radical that it is a relationship with something else, and it makes us reflect on who we are. Like Ricoeur says, translation means to give justice to the genius foreigner, and it means to establish a good distance between linguistics and something else. Your language is just as important as mine, and it is a formula of equality, the formula of recognizing diversity. And so we can also think of the translator as an emblematic figure of our contemporary multicultural and multilinguistical because of representing another relationship. What does a translator do? He tries to understand what is something that is so far away from the foreigner to what is real. And he tries to identify what pertains to his world. He tries to take away the diversity and to try and welcome this diversity. And so translation has become important because it talks about the fragility of our identity, of being able to understand. And it is a way of which makes us stop to have a dialogue and tries to make us find reasons of knowledge outside of us. So the language that we have taken as we were children, language develops certain values that we have learned to grow up with. Something It makes us, it decides for us who we are and how we should behave. It behaves in a different way. Language is something that we are, and it can also be a way to abuse something that we are not. And so the person who translates goes beyond the walls, because it looks at the relationship with the other, and it makes the dialogue between one person and another possible. There's no need for me to say to you that translation opens reality, but it has become a kind of stereotype that we need to repossess. The need to translate is an openness to reality, which is an openness to one person to another. An idea that every translator has is a resource. If the other culture, the other language, doesn't understand, why should I translate? If it doesn't understand, why should I translate? So an openness to reality, the meeting with another one, has unimaginable prospects, and can really deal with who we are. So I think translating doesn't just reflect intellectual reflection, but is an experience. Translating between the author and the reader and the author is a marvelous experience, because it can also be defined as a linguistic hosting, a welcoming. It allows us to dialogue with other people, with other reflections. And actually, I think that the confusion of languages has never ever been a condemnation. It doesn't allow us to listen to things that we think we have already known. Maybe there are phrases between friends that people understand between themselves. If languages and culture don't endure or don't experience the foreign aspects, they will age, they will get older. If you want to regain and earn and by your father, in fact, we need to be very free in respect of this to be able to regain this legacy. Incontro means something to stay in front of, or the in incontro means something to stay in front of, and in means something inside. Incontro means meeting. The education of translating can be a model or an expression of meeting. In fact, there's only two ways that we can translate. We can translate by domesticating or taming the other foreigner. We can translate without making damage to the other culture. Or there is a way that we can behave we can translate, trying to maintain our dignity, and also maybe some people can translate refusing the fact that there is a foreign person and be alienated. In fact, to show the other to meet the other with their other language is a big challenge. It permits us to look at things in a different kind of way. So cultural literature can also be expressed as a meeting with another person, is full of these kind of dialogues and intertwining dialogue. So if you think of the translation of Aristotle in the medieval, where he had Arabic translations and which came to Spain, and he was about to spread two current articles in the 12th century, categories and interpretazione. This had also reminded me of the literature of the Spanish Golden Age in Spain. Or think also about the Bible, these pieces of literature, to live the translation, to live the experience. In all of these cases, the meeting with a tradition is different. And it has met something great and amazing. Translating then educates us and challenges us, because we can't just talk about translation as if we can't compare it with something real. Between two languages, two worlds, there's always some kind of difference that we have to unfortunately accept. You cannot know if you do not accept this. But the problem is not the linguistics behind it. But the problem there is a book that is which is entitled Experience of Tradition. There's a definition. This definition has never been enough for me. But this almost provokes me. How elastic does this almost have to be? How flexible does this almost have to be? To establish this almost, it has to be negotiated. But what is a subject of this negotiation? Not words, not language. We have to start with other things. For example, you need to negotiate something so fundamental is the reciprocal prejudices. As Wittgenstein said, I want to underline this point. Language is a barrier for the inherent intelligence. It is a type of life which gives us a barrier of acceptability and mutual trust. As Pope Francis said, Lazzaro has taught us that the other is a gift. The right relation with the person consists to recognize gratuitous the value. Every life that we meet is a gift and deserves to be welcomed, respected, and loved. And so this translation involves us in some kind of paradox. Conserve something that is so foreign to us. The other one should never be looked at as an obstacle. Thank you.
Davide, e con la poesia?
Davide, and so with poetry, what's going on? Good evening. Thank you so much for dialogue for today. There was a friend who had called me who was talking about how he wanted to come to the meeting. His name is Antonio Santori. And he was talking about this poem that is in this book here. It is... I'm going to read now this poem. Because why to be in this place is empty. And we can say, and we ask, where are we? What's our task? The darkness, and do you see the body? Just our body can say that we are white, distant, wind, blues, winter, shadow of things, something other, listen and kiss. Think. It's a privilege to say, smell of the house, a hand on top of the skin for the first time, to say in the infinity, something that has happened, strange, sister, mother, stars, to say something beside, scared, to be, to exist. For this, I live, and everything for me seems unnamed. For this, everything, life seems to me something unnamed. And coming somewhere to like the meeting where something like this is so sensitive to a topic like this, as Paggi had said, education is something if there's a fire in the house, we can understand that there's a fire in the house. It's not just enough just to say it, we actually have to intervene. And education, especially who goes to school or anybody, cannot exist if it's not just a method problem. It's a problem of method. The educative method is can be a problem. So to introduce an educative method in schools,
spaventato del dibattito che ne è nato che ha ritirato il libro.
I republished a book with Bompiani to help with this method. The real cultural battle is not what we usually think on a high level, but the method of education is very important as a battle. What do I really have at heart? What do I hold dear? The fact that the relationship with authors is an important relationship, not because we have to save literature, because it saves itself. Leopardi is fine, he's well. Literature is like water, you can never stop it. It keeps going by itself. There's even the exhibition in Russia shows us that you can't stop culture. The problem is that we make Ungaretti, Leopardi boring for young students. This becomes boring if we don't compare what love is between Dante and Garcia Lorca, and we only think about love from De Filippi's point of view, which is a TV presenter in Italy. I think that the approach that we have which is currently disastrous, we haven't tried to change it. We haven't tried to make a methodological change. The first thing, Antonio's poem already said it, but also Andrea Moro in his intervention. The use of words. Sorry if I tend to be a little bit disorganized in my speech, but there is method even in folly. Earlier it was said that the words that we use, even before becoming a means of communication, and many times we treat literature as an expressive problem. It is a problem of knowledge, actually. The naming things is used in order to get to know the world. Words that have been endowed man in order to get to know the world. Words are not only an instrument of communication, or not only anyway, since we know that this is an era of narcissism. You have to have a constant confirmation on Facebook of everything that you do. Instead of insisting on expression, we must insist on the power of knowledge of words. And during the class meetings, we know about the world. We know biology, mathematics. You look after expression to us literature teachers. No. We know more, perhaps. We have used words in the same way to get to know things like chemistry, and maybe perhaps more than chemistry and biology, etc. If you don't, as a first step, avenge the power of the power of knowledge in words, we are defeated. The second point, in this focusing on the student, how does this happen? Through a text, through the weaving of words. It's not like a spider which weaves its web, but man, it's an art form. Man creatively weaves. In theater, in this theater of humanity, to understand the theater of humanity, which is literature, since it's specifically human, we don't have to go and get principles from who knows where. This is completely contradictory to human nature. We don't have to have specified laws for to understand the principles of humanity. It's the same thing when you encounter a human phenomenon. So we have the element of risk. There is no relationship without a risk. You don't know how that relationship is going to end. Otherwise, it'll be a false relationship. The second thing, as Stefano said earlier on translation, the encounter with something that is diverse, different, and something that is the abyss of diversity, as Giussani used to say, the other. And there's an element of ambiguity, which is impossible to eliminate. Even in love between wife and husband, there must be a space for at least a bit of a shadow, otherwise the relationship cannot work. Luckily, perhaps unluckily, anyway, this is the way things are. In a conference of this kind, a man at the back of the hall stood up and said, "Rondoni, we can't understand your poems." And I went on speaking about poetic language, etc. And then I responded a little bit more brutally to him. But you understand, and do you all of a sudden understand everything about your wife, everything about your children? And this is another important element, a methodological element, which defeats all the rationalist and scientific pretenses on literature. If by knowledge we understand some kind of a scheme or preconceived idea, this isn't knowledge, because your wife, for example, is never something that is prepackaged and preconceived, but it is a relationship. It's always new. Otherwise, it can't be called a relationship. This is the difference between art and what we think art is. We put it into categories and we try to define it. And somebody says, "I don't understand." But there's an ambiguity, a shadow. And it's useless to expect students of 17 years old to become experts of Leopardi. Phil Collins, an American writer, songwriter, said, "Finally, in third year of high school in Oklahoma, we finally understood Stevenson." What does this mean? We finished Ungaretti, we finished Montale. No, maybe you've started a relationship. No, you haven't. You can't say that you've finished it. Instead, they say that they have finished. They've done and they've started and done that author. This anxiety to understand, we need it's a question of method. Whoever has fear of humanity will obviously impose certain preconceived ideas onto literature. Because the second hypothesis is uncomfortable. It involves a risk. If you're afraid of the mystery, who a great genius of humanity said, called a pilandrone, somebody who is afraid of the mystery, it is clear that your relationship with the text will be based on 3 or 4 preconceived ideas. The other thing I wanted to say to you, and I go towards my conclusion, is that because of this, if we take this seriously, the word risk implies, in fact, freedom. Your freedom and the person with which you are having a dialogue with. This is why literature should not be obligatory for students of 16 years old in high school, because it must be an invitation. If you want to get to the root, the importance of literature, you must ask their freedom to do so. It has to pass through their freedom. To encounter a text can be important for their humanity, but if you're not able to do this as a teacher, to have a dialogue on this level, change job. If you are good at teaching literature, I'll give you my students for 6 months, do this kind of a work on Leopardi and Montale, and this also obviously has to do with art, not only literature. If 80 or 90% of the students are interested in continuing to study this, good, continue. If they're not, change job, do something else. Because it happens too often that you go into a school and you ask them, Manzoni, and everybody goes, boo. The problem, a lady turned around and said, Manzoni is great, and the children are not stupid. Where's the problem? How did this go wrong? This seems apparently as a turning over of the method, this suggestion of mine to make literature not obligatory after 16 years of age in high school. I understand it's a particular hypothesis. I don't think that my idea is the best idea. I am open to others. But those who are defending the current system are idiots. I don't agree with them. I don't agree that there isn't a problem to resolve here. I'm interested in a change of method. The last thing is that, as it has already been said, speaking about translations and the fact that we can't talk about readers in an abstract sense, because we have Luigi, we have Mark, etc. It's that reader over there and that reader over there. They're concrete people. And since a text is based on a personal relationship, we don't have a public. It's a personal relationship. There's no public audience. And the relationship that we can compare it to, the relationship between reader and text, is the relationship between friends, friendship. A guest, after a certain point, either it becomes an enemy or they become friends. Hospitality can be the beginning of a new friend. It can't be imposed or forced. I understand that my method perhaps is not the best, and I am really open to other opportunities, of other suggestions. But the problem of aesthetic experience in Italy is paramount for our culture. We don't have petrol, we don't have other things. We have Giotto, Armani, we have food. This is our responsibility. It's a political responsibility. This is a political responsibility to transmit beauty. No matter where you go, Italy is beauty, gusto, and we are losing on this terrain. recently. I want to finish on the point of friendship. Dante, who knew quite a lot about texts, I also translated Baudelaire, etc. And Dante says, in paradise, he makes two philosophers meet, and they speak about friendship. And he invents a word. Se tu mi intuassi, tu mi in me, which means, if you entered in me, I enter into you. The literature is this strange mixture of going into one, going into the other, becoming one, becoming part of the other. Intuarsi is a sign of the impossible. Become part of me. It is everything is impossible. And nothing is possible without your gaze being present. I thank our three speakers. It would be great to stay here for hours to continue the discussion we began. They charged our curiosity with questions on themes relating to school and the status quo of schools here in Italy. And I thought it is very beautiful that there can be a space in which speaking of life and speaking of the things that we do be not a repetition of what we are, but be the relaunching, the reposing of the questions that consume our minds. This year, we are insisting a lot on the possibility of contributing through donations. You will see the Dona Ora desks, and it is possible to donate to the volunteers that are wearing green t-shirts, so that places like this can continue to flourish.